So how do you buy your first rental property? How do you find them? How do you run the numbers? How do you double check everything? How do you know if it's even a good deal or not? What are all the steps you have to take? Well, that's what today's video is all about. I'm Justin Brown. Make sure you hit that like and subscribe button and watch till the end because every step I'm about to give you has some valuable tips in it. Step one is the most important step because before you start digging in and looking at properties, you have to be able to determine if the property is a good investment or not and know how much it's going to cost you. And to do this, you have to know the biggest and most important expense you're going to have with it all, which is the mortgage. So step one, you got to find out what programs you qualify for, what the payments look like, how much cash out of pocket you're going to need to pay, and what those monthly payments are projected to be. But I'm going to give you some basics around the most common programs available to buy rental properties. So you got FHA, conventional, non-QM, and private money or hard money loans. So we'll start with my favorite, which is FHA. Now you could use FHA to buy a 1 to 4 unit property with only 3.5% down, but the catch is you have to live in one of those units. So it's going to have to be your primary residence where you live in one unit and you rent out the rest. And you have to plan on living in one of the units for at least 12 months. Now, FHA will require at least a 580 FICO score if you're doing the minimum down payment of 3.5%, but they'll also let you use 75% of the rents from the other units as income to help you qualify. So by doing this, you could typically qualify for a much bigger purchase on a multi-unit that you would qualify by yourself on a single family. So if you're a first-time home buyer, this is definitely the best way to start. It's called house hacking, where you could basically have the rents from the other units cover your mortgage payment completely for you. Now, you got to be careful if you're doing this because there's this thing called the self-sufficiency test you have to know, which basically means that 75% to 85% of the rents from all the units, including the market rents from the one you're going to live in, so the rents from all the units have to be able to cover the mortgage payment if you weren't to live there anymore. That's called the self-sufficiency test. Your lender should definitely know all about this, and I'm going to put a more detailed video together on that soon. Next, we got conventional loans. So with conventional loans, you're typically going to need at least 25% down when you're buying a 2 to 4 unit investment property. And you're usually going to need at least a 640 to a 660 FICO score to even qualify for a conventional loan, but honestly, it'll be tough to get without at least a 680 FICO score. It just depends. But conventional loans don't have the self-sufficiency requirement, and they'll typically still give you at least 75% of the rents from the other units to help you with qualifying. But both FHA and conventional loans are going to be full documentation loans, meaning they're going to want your W-2s, your pay stubs, possibly your tax returns, your last 2 years work history, maybe even your firstborn. No, but seriously, they ask for quite a bit. They're going to dig into everything. Now, another option I'm going to talk about is non-QM loans. Basically, these are loans that don't follow or meet conventional guidelines. Non-QM loans are typically going to want at least 20% down for a 1 to 4 unit property, and I've seen some lenders go as high as 8 units with only 20% down. And the beauty is these loans offer alternative documentation for income. Some of them require no income. They'll basically qualify you without looking at any of your income or your job history as long as the property pays for itself. This is called a DSCR loan, which is debt service coverage ratio. I've seen some of these lenders go as low as around a 660 FICO score to qualify for this program. And now different lenders on this program have different requirements on what they call the coverage ratio, the DSCR ratio. So for example, a 1-to-1 ratio just means that the rents need to match or exceed the mortgage payment. And then you might see some lenders that want a 1 to 1.25 ratio, which means the rents need to be at least 125% of the mortgage payment. But for the most part, a lot of the DSCR lenders now are okay with just a 1-to-1 ratio. Some will even go a negative ratio, meaning that the rents could be less than the mortgage payment. Personally, if I'm looking for a rental property, I will never buy one where the rents don't match the mortgage payment or exceed it. The reason why somebody might still want this is if they're buying an Airbnb, where the lenders don't look at the Airbnb rents. They only look at the market long-term rents. So sometimes some properties, the long-term rents don't make sense, but the Airbnb rents definitely do. So if you're in one of these positions, then you're going to want to go with a negative DSCR loan. And last is hard money or private money. Now these loans could vary quite a bit, and it really depends on the property itself. Now typically these loans don't require any income either. And in some cases, you don't have to put any money down. I'll give you an example of how that works. Let's say there's a property you want to buy that needs a lot of work, and you're buying it for way under market value. Let's say you're buying a property for $300,000 and it needs about $100,000 of work, which is going to be all in about $400,000, right? But let's say after that work's done, the ARV, which stands for after repair value, let's say the ARV on that property is then going to be $500,000. So it's going to cost you 400, but the market around there shows that that home's going to be worth around 500,000. That's a big chunk of equity. So if you do find a deal like this, there are actually hard money lenders that will finance the project, they'll finance the repairs, and they might not need any money down. But you're still going to have to pay the closing costs, which could be $7,000 to $15,000 or more, just depending on what the fees are from the hard money lender. And even though, let's say you're financing $100,000 for the repair costs, when the loan closes, they're not going to immediately release that $100,000 in repair budget to you. What's going to happen is you're going to have to pay for the repairs out of your own pocket up front. And then when the different parts of the project are done, you can have the lender send somebody out to verify parts are complete, and then they'll reimburse you for those costs. So let's say I'm going to do the flooring and the flooring is going to cost me 10 grand. I'm going to have to pay for that flooring to get done. And let's say it cost me that 10,000. Once it's done, I let the lender know. They'll send an inspector out who will verify, yes, the flooring's done. I send them the receipt, and then they will cut me back that $10,000 reimbursement. So to do these loans, you're still going to need money. You're going to need money for the closing costs, and you're going to need money to handle the repairs along the way. And you're going to need money for what's called carrying costs. You're going to need money to cover the monthly mortgage payment, the utilities, and other expenses while you're holding that property and it's getting fixed up for all those months. So as you can see, there's a lot of different paths you could go down when it comes to financing a rental property. So that's why you got to get that information dialed in first. You got to know the loan terms you're getting. You got to know what kind of down payment and closing costs you're going to have to pay. And you're going to have to know what kind of monthly payment you could expect and the price range you're going to be able to look in. So talk to a lender, or you could always reach out to us because that's what I do. Step 2. So now that you dug in and know what you qualify for, you know how much money you're going to need, and you have a good idea of the budget and price point you're going to need to be looking at, it's time to start looking at properties. Now, there's a lot of different directions you could go in here, but I highly recommend you work with a realtor that's also an investor themselves, because working with a team of experienced professionals along the way to give you advice and double check your numbers could be invaluable. You could search local investor meetups in your area and start networking. There's different Facebook investor groups you could join, or you could just start going to local open houses and asking different agents. But it's definitely important to start building that network of experienced real estate agents to start working with. And once you do start meeting different agents at these groups, at these networking events, and at these open houses, don't be afraid to ask them what their investment portfolio looks like. Ask them their experience. And same with your lender. Again, having a team of experienced professionals is really going to help. Now, if you do decide to look on your own, I personally will just look on Zillow, Crexi, LoopNet, and I'll still join investor groups on Facebook and locally. And I start asking around and letting people know what I'm looking for. Now, on those websites, you are able to filter by price, by types of property, multifamily, apartments, single family. You can narrow down some different characteristics and neighborhoods. You're going to want to narrow down what area are you even going to look in. Are you going to invest locally where you live, or are you going to start looking in other markets? And again, networking with other investors and groups, you can start asking around and getting ideas of what markets other people are buying. There's definitely a whole lot of information around that, so I'm going to save that for another video as well. Step 3, once you start looking at properties, you have to know how to run the numbers. You have to see if they cash flow. Now, no one is psychic and no one's going to be able to predict every possible cost or risk, but we could use history and experience to guide us on the different things we should be taking into account and preparing for. We're mitigating our risks by anticipating common things that come up. So before I start diving into all the different expenses that you got to take into consideration, there's some great rental calculators you could use to plug all this information in. Mine's on my Instagram page and my bio link for free. There's plenty of others online if you just Google it. But here are the main things I always make sure I'm taking into account. So there's 3 categories of expenses I use. There's fixed expenses, there's variable expenses, and anticipated expenses. Now, fixed expenses are set amounts that are pretty consistent or the same month in, month out, or season in, season out, like your mortgage payment, your home insurance, your property taxes, if there's some pest control, seasonal tree trimming, snow plowing, your HOA dues, things that are just typically the same amount every time and you can count on it. Now, variable expenses are expenses that can change from month to month depending on the season or just depending on what it is. So like your electricity, your gas bill, your water bill, things like that. And last, there's anticipated expenses. These are things that you don't know exactly how much, you don't know exactly when, but you know they're going to happen. Like repairs, vacancies, or capital expenditures. Capital expenditures are like repairs, but they're for major, bigger items like the air conditioning, the water heater, the roof, things that'll last a while, but not forever. And you can start taking that into account now when you run your numbers. So how do I find all this out? Well, basically up front, when I find a property I like, I'm just going to ask them. Now, the thing is, if it's already a rental property or there's already property management in place, they should already have a pretty detailed profit and loss that lists most of the stuff out that they've already had to pay for. And then you're going to anticipate some other things that might come up in the future. And if it's already being listed and marketed as a rental property, then a good agent should already have that information ready for a potential buyer. Plus, if you're already working with an experienced agent or loan officer, they're going to know to help you ask for these things and help you analyze them once the numbers come in. But basically just ask, what are all the expenses the owner has every month, every year, every season? What maintenance, what repairs? What utilities is the owner having to pay for versus the tenants? Typically, if there's split utilities, meaning there's separate meters for the utilities for each unit, the tenants are going to pay for it for the most part. But if there's utilities that aren't split, like the water, electric, gas, any of it's not split, then typically the owner is going to be paying for that. So a question I like to ask up front is, are the utilities split and which ones? And if they are there any utilities at all that the owner still has to pay for? Because sometimes there's some common area electricity that's going on. So if on like a 4-unit property, there might actually be 5 meters, one for each of those units, and then a separate meter maybe for some common area that the owners pay. So you want to ask all that stuff. So once you've gathered all that information, now it's time to plug all those numbers into a rental property calculator to see what the cash flow is. Now, diving into exactly how to run it all through a property calculator and things like that, I'm going to do a separate video on that because that's going to be quite a bit of information on its own. But if you have any questions, just ask me. Or make sure you subscribe so when I release that video, you get notified about it. So step 4, if the numbers look good and you take the next step of actually writing an offer on the property and it's accepted, congratulations, you're now in escrow. And it's time to verify everything. You're going to want to get updated mortgage numbers from your lender. You're going to want to get a quote for your homeowner's insurance. You're going to want to ask the seller for 12 months of utility bills for all the utilities that the owner's responsible for, because they might have told you, oh, it's about $200 a month for electricity. But once you get all 12 months of those bills and average it out, those numbers might not match anymore. I'm also going to ask for the income and expenses on that property for the last 2 years plus year to date. Now, if they have a property manager, they should have a lot of those numbers already ready. I would even go as far as asking for the Schedule E of their tax return with all their personal information blacked out, but still listing that property and all the income and expenses that they claim to the IRS. Because typically they're going to write every single expense they have on that property when they file their taxes. And last, you're going to want to make sure you get an Estoppel Certificate for all of the units on that property. This is a verification signed by all the tenants verifying all the terms on their lease and anything that the owners promised them. This is a certification that's signed by the tenants that's going to verify all the terms on their existing lease. Going to confirm how much their monthly rent is, if they're behind, how much of a deposit the owner has on them, if there's any outstanding items or promises owed by the seller. It is a must-have document to make sure after you purchase the property, you don't have any discrepancies from what the seller told you and what the tenants start to tell you after you take over. Believe me, I've bought properties, and even though I have signed lease agreements, I've had tenants say, oh no, that was changed. We made a verbal agreement, or they promised they were going to do this, or no, the rent actually got lowered because of this. They might say all sorts of things, but their tone completely changes when I pull up that estoppel that they signed and the owner signed. So make sure you get one. So while I'm digging into verifying all the numbers and expenses and everything on the property, I'm also going to start calling local property managers. And to find property managers, I'm going to start asking the agents if they have any referrals or recommendations. I'm going to go on Yelp. I'm going to look online. And ideally, I'm going to see a good chunk of property managers in the area. Because if there's only a couple property managers in the area, if they suck, then I'm stuck. So I'm out at that point. So I highly recommend you don't buy in an area that doesn't have a good choice of property managers if you choose to use them. I'm then going to ask the property managers about the area, about the market, about what the rents are, what they charge, how quickly they think vacancies are filled in that area. So then I'm going to get a good idea of what they think the marketability is of those properties that might be for rent if they're vacant, or if they ever become vacant, what it'll look like. You're also going to be getting an appraisal report from the lender that you're working with, and that appraisal report is going to show you comparable rentals in that area, so you could also see what comparable properties are renting for around you as well. And the appraiser is going to verify that the price you're paying is in line with the value of the property. And last, don't forget home inspections. You're definitely going to want to get a home inspection. I'd also recommend finding a home inspector that's capable of running a camera through the sewer line to check if there's any cracks or issues going on there. Plus, get a licensed professional to check the heater, the AC, and the water heater as well. So now that you've gathered all that information, you have all your reports, it's time to start rerunning all those numbers and make sure the property still makes sense, that it still cash flows. And if it does, and you're happy with the appraisal and the home inspection results, then you're one step closer to the finish line. But if not, cancel, keep looking. Because if you're uncomfortable with any of the information, the appraisal, the home inspection, or the numbers on the property just aren't jiving for you, then cancel. Don't let anybody talk you into it. There's plenty of properties out there. Move on to the next. So The fifth and final step, if you've made it this far, is actually closing and taking possession of the property. But when you're getting close to the actual closing date, it's a good idea to get your property manager lined up. Make sure you've picked one, make sure you've gone through any paperwork that they're sending you and it's all signed and ready to go. And then also get a list of all the service providers and utilities that you're going to be responsible for and start getting those lined up to be switched to your name and start when you take ownership. Another tip is I would highly recommend opening a separate bank account for each and every property you ever purchase, so that all the money in and all the money out is easily accounted for and trackable, and you know your numbers without having it all commingled with your personal funds or other accounts with other things going on. Because believe me, at the end of the month or at the end of the year, if I ever want to dive in and see my cash flow numbers on that property, it's pretty clear when it's all in one account. And your CPA is going to love you for this as well. And don't forget to subscribe, because you don't want to miss the new videos I'll be putting out with different ways to build wealth through real estate and personal finance.